So we're talking about the QMSR. Really, there's no reason to panic here. And Dan, I'm going to apologize because I know I have a slide for Steve and a slide for myself, and we didn't have a separate slide for you
Not a problem.
that we can add on. But we'll get you in there, and of course, being one of our partners, we make sure that we'll connect you with the follow-up. So this is Steve's information from out east. He went to Lehigh and the several certifications and various pieces and contact information. You'll see our contact information at the end again. And here's myself. Um, Not quite as long as in industry as Steve, but got a good 25 years under my belt, and some similar packages. And again, these slides will come to you after the session here.
Dan, why don't, before we start the technical,
Go
Dan,
ahead,
why don't you
Dan.
introduce yourself since we forgot your
Sure,
slide?
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dan Purvis, Velentium Medical. I started Velentium Medical in 2012, and our goal was to create a one-stop shop where people could partner with us on design, development, and manufacturing. And so we partner with QRx to handle quality, regulatory, and keep everything in line. But we then provide a lot of the documents that they are going to say are necessary on your behalf. I'm an electrical engineer by training from Texas A&M, have an MBA from Rice, and have made a career out of finding people smarter than me to work with me. And that's been really, really a great thing, including Mark and Steve here at QRX. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and
Thank
as
you.
Mark mentioned, Velentium is one of our partners. That's why we picked the name partner in partners in our name, is because we maintain those kind of relationships with complementary providers like Velentium. So we're happy to have them as our partner for engineering services and such.
And Dan, you helped me remind me that I still haven't put my MBA on this here that I have
Oh,
from Argosy University. So at some point I'll put that on there. All right. So we're going to jump in and dive into some history with regard to the quality system regulation or QS reg. And guys, I know what happens lots of times is people hear the term QSR all the time and associate that with the QS reg. You probably won't hear me say that. You're going to hear me say QS reg because I've had it pounded into me by so many FDAers along the way. Because QSR is actually defined in the regulation as quality system record. And so they'll if you run into FDA folks, they'll usually correct you that it is the QS reg or QS regulation. So, but just some of these pieces. So, and it started back in '78. So, just a few short decades ago, that the 820 was initially established with good manufacturing practices. Along the side of that, some of the quality management or quality system practices came into being with ISO 9000 and that series of 9001, 9002, and 9003 that were made for various pieces of manufacturing and design. So 9001 had the focus on design, 2 had the focus on manufacturing, and 9003 had the focus on testing or measurement. Okay. Um, and so those things came alongside that. As those came into being, and the Safe Medical Devices Act granted FDA some authority over design controls, they started working on the current QS regulation, and um, and that was brought forward then in '96. You'll see, but in the meantime, 9004, the 9000 series update was brought along with preventive and preventive quality, proactive planning, and all of those pieces. Then the first edition of 1345 came into being. And yes, there was a EN predecessor, but this was the first international quality systems for medical aimed at medical devices for regulatory purposes. Really aligned with ISO 9001. Um, and so that was moved forward. There was another piece that was 13488, which is aligned to 9002 again, which was manufacturing aimed at. But those two pieces were introduced in 96 alongside then the QS reg as it currently is being introduced. So it was updated to good manufacturing to include design controls in 96 and so forth. And then since then, it really hasn't been substantially updated. So we're talking 30 years, folks, that really it hasn't been updated. In the meantime, 9001 was updated in 2000, and this it was meant to be a all-inclusive, um, introducing the process approach. So 9002 and 3 were withdrawn, and 9001 became the overall quality management system. Again, no change to 820. In 2003, some similar updates were done to 13485, and 1348 was withdrawn. So it was all inclusive for medical device quality management systems to include design controls, manufacturing controls, purchasing, and all of the rest of the stuff that has been incorporated in 1345. Again, no changes. Then we did some major updates in 2015 and 2016, and this is where I came into working with the working group. In 2012, we started on the update to 1345. One of the big things that came in was then the risk-based approach, risk-based thinking, and the concepts of incorporating risk within the processes. Things like timeliness and doing things commensurate with the risk, or proportionate to the risk. Okay. And so all of those came into being in quality management systems, but still no updates to 820. Um, and so this is where I think some of the frustration started to build, because I mean now we're talking already at that point 20 years since the update had been done. Okay. Um, so we start moving things forward very intentionally. Again, I started working in 2012 on the 1345 standard as part of the ISO working group. The 2016 was intended to align with the regulations. Okay. Now, of course, a major focus of that, while we're working with IMDF, but a major focus was alignment with the US QS regulation, right? Because at this time they were also working on MDSAP, the MDSAP audit approach, and making sure that we had good alignment there. They were actually working on EU MDR at that point as well. And so we wanted to make sure that we had good alignment to the content of the standard to be able to support those regulations, right? And align to having an adequate quality management system for those regulatory purposes. And so that's where we really started working on this. And so many people will talk about that, this has been worked on since whatever they want to say, 2000, 17, 18, 19. And I'm like, no, we've been working on it since 2012 to get this alignment with the QS reg. Okay. So the current QS reg is valid through February 2nd, 2026. Yes, it is a day turnover. So February 1st, we're under the QS reg. February 2nd, we're on the QMSR. Okay. While that's true, it really has been a 2-year transition, with the draft rule being out there, the final rule being issued on February 2nd, 2024. We've had this time to adjust. Now, I'm going to say over and over again, for industry, I'm not sure that I see much of a problem here, because most of us have been operating under ISO 13485 anyhow, even if we were just in the US under and really only had to meet the requirements of the QS reg. Most people looked at 1345 because, I mean, you have to face that we're often operating in a global environment, and the global requirements then again come from ISO 13485. Okay. And so continue with that status, AMI TIR 102 and the practical guide on ISO 1345. And I'm going to flip over to a website just for a second here. So if you go out there and search for FDA QMSR, you will get to this FDA landing page. Okay. And they provided an update here. Right on that landing page, they give references to those two documents that I just talked about. So the practical guide and AMI TIR 102. Okay. So you can get those right there. If you forget what they are, again, you just do that internet search and you'll get to this landing page. In addition to those things, as you scroll down on this document, you'll see a hyperlink down here to the final rule itself. And I have a few different portions that we're going to come back to as I show you, pieces of that final rule. Okay? All right. So those are those references, and then the final rule we just showed. Again, if you're familiar with QS Reg, you know that there's a preamble to the current regulation. Okay. There is a new preamble for the QMSR. Okay, and that is part of the written final rule. Okay, and I'm just going to flip back over to that for a second here. Okay, and so what you see, again, if you clicked on that hyperlink and got yourself to the final rule, you start scrolling down. You want to look for this section that's called Section A, General Comments on the Proposed Rule. Okay, and they did just as they did for the current preamble, right? There's comments that have been received from the FDA, from QRx. We submitted several comments, and other people from industry. And those comments then were consolidated, and FDA formally responds to this. Now, this is part of the regulation because it's part of that final rule, the final publication. It is part of the regulation. And so these are the interpretations that will stand until the regulation is updated. Okay. Any questions as we're going along? Again, there's 83 comments for you to take a look through there, and how they're answering them. We will cover several of them as we go along. And the offer that Dan has at the end here is he's gone through them and highlighted some very specific ones as well, and he'll be able to provide that to you as part of the part of your gift for attending this session.
And I just wanted to add the 83 comments. Oh, this is perfect tie into this. That's comments by the public and by industry.
Right.
It's just so you're clear who's making those comments. So, they've had a comment period where anybody could, ask questions. And so it's great because the preamble captures all those comments and then provides FDA's answers to them, which gives you perspective on their thinking. The other thing I always like to point out is 83 is an incredibly small number.
Yeah.
Normally, when they put out something like that for public comment, it's hundreds, if not over 1,000.
Several hundred. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So the fact that only 83 came through and there were some key themes that were pretty consistent themes indicated that for the most part, it looked like everybody considered that FDA got this right. So that was an interesting perception there that they created.
And QRX was part of that. We had both the opportunity to do the comment as well as make a formal presentation to the advisory board as they were going through the draft rule. So we had some good opportunity to provide our input, and I'll highlight a couple of those things. Okay. So in addition, in that final rule to those 83 comments and responses, and there's a bunch of stuff at the beginning that has to do with the requirements as they change regulations in assessing the cost and all that kind of stuff. But the important stuff for us starts with those 83 comments. And then it goes into the two different sections of the regulation that are changing. So Part 820, and then it gives the Part A and Part B, the general provisions, supplemental provisions, and then it goes into also 21 CFR Part 4 for our combination product folks that are coming along with that because we had previously given references to parts of 820 that now have to reference ISO 13485. And so Part 4 is also updated as part of the final rule. Okay, it's one final rule affecting two regulations and incorporates all of those comments and that kind of stuff. Okay, so there is no separate rule on 21 CFR Part 4. It's the same rule. Okay. Just to give you a little bit of a picture here, this is what the current regulation structure looks like. this is what that future structure looks like. So if I advance this, what you see is all of those things that are now have the red lines through them are pieces of 1345 that take over for those other subparts. Okay, a couple of subparts because they have additional details in them, the labeling and some of the records pieces go into that new subpart B. And so subpart A becomes
Click one
the
more time, Mark.
yep, click one more time. Oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
so subpart A, including the definitions and so forth, is what comes through because there are some changes to definitions, substantial changes to the definitions that were there. But subpart A is really the main part of it. Subpart B adds some additional details, and then the rest of it is all blank, right? So what was subpart A through O becomes subparts A and B. Okay, so you can see how much has been reduced. Now in this era of government reduction in regulations, this is a good thing. Okay. All right. So let's go into some of the details of the regulation and talk about this, what's there. The scope is not substantially changed. Okay. It still talks about having an adequate quality management system, the reason for having a quality management system, all of those pieces. And the scope stays substantially the same. Again, that's by definition, and as Steve said, they got it right here. The QS reg didn't need to change in scope, it just needed to change in content. And so what we're seeing here is, and I'll talk about some more, what we're seeing here is they're saying, hey, there's a better place for you to go look and see what the requirements are. We're not going to rewrite all of them. Let's just use what's out there, right? And so many of the definitions, the terminology, all of that kind of stuff could be consolidated into what the rest of the world is using. And again, I think FDA got this right in making sure that we have the things that are particular to U.S. requirements, but we can agree on most of the requirements, right?
Something I would add there, Mark, is there's a comment in section 3 that gives the agency's thought process on this. And it's the first comment in my addendum, but it's essentially says the agency's goals for regulatory simplicity and global harmonization.
Right.
And the goal is then to reduce the burden on regulated industry overall. And then I love the last statement. I think it's important that all of us in the med device industry remember it all the time. Therefore, providing patients more efficient access to necessary devices. That this
Right.
should get more devices to the marketplace to help more people more quickly as a result of having one standard that should work across the entire globe.
For sure. Okay. And I can tell you, Steve and I for sure are seeing that as we have more and more clients that are in Europe coming to the US as first to market.
Mhm.
Okay. But there's these definitions that you need to go look at. We will highlight a couple of them as we go along, uh, but understand that, and I'll talk about it some more after a bit here. Right. So the next section, so 820.7, the new 820.7, is probably the most important part, right? Because that is where we talk about incorporation by reference. Okay. And this is where it points directly to ISO 13485, 2016, and Section 3 of ISO 9000, 2015. Okay. Because they have used that dated reference, and we'll come up when we answer these questions quite often, because it uses a dated reference, it means it is that reference and that one only. Any updates or changes or amendments or anything else that happens are not applicable until they change the regulation. Okay. So if a change was done in to 1345, a next version, which might be, I don't know, at this point, probably 2030, maybe. Uh, but and I'll talk about some of that later. But it will not be applicable unless the regulation is changed. Okay, because it's that dated reference.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, when you did the first slide, showing the history. If people often wonder why those of us who are, heavily involved with the regs and the standards often always add, well, not often, we pretty much always add the year when we're talking about the standards. This is why, because those dates actually matter. One, you get the timeline, you get a sense for where things diverged and came back together. But also, as Mark just pointed out, right, where you see that referenced by date in a standard or a reg, it's a static placeholder now.
Yeah.
So, right, if there's no
It's
year, then you can assume it's always talking about the latest version, whatever it is. But when you see the year, it holds it forever until that gets updated.
it's just like revision numbers on your documents, whether you use A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3. The date being there is the revision or addition, right?
Interestingly enough, because it's incorporated by reference, 1345 2016 is now available for viewing for free.
Yep.
I don't know if you're going to get there or not, but there's
We will cover that. I'll cover the specific reference and give the website so that people can get it. Yeah, Dan, you just put it up there, the IBR reference. Um, so we will get to that. Um, so that's of course applicable. One of the things I often say to people is there's many of us that maybe have the little blue books that have the regulation in them. And so you can always use that as your kind of quick reference guide, right? What this is in the regulation is essentially them saying, "Hey, there's this other book over here that has all of these requirements in it. Go look at that book for all of the requirements." Hey, this incorporation by reference now means that legally 1345 will be enforced by FDA, the requirements that are in 1345. It has the same status as if they actually wrote it in the regulation. Okay, that's what incorporation by reference means. Okay, and like Dan said, because of that, all U.S. regulations have to be available for free. And so ANSI has made that available for free on the incorporation by reference website. And there's several other standards that are available there. The key to that, though, is you can't print it, you can't download it. All you can do is view it. So we still advise clients to buy their edition of their version of that standard. Okay. Now, the other part of the general provisions, again, because the scope didn't change, the requirements of having a quality management system and the requirements around a quality management system are substantially the same as what they were in the QS reg. So that part, that section in part A is substantially the same, just a drawn over. So really the only changes that happened in this section are in definitions and that new section of incorporation by reference. Okay. Moving on to part B, many people will say that these are changes from, these are the changes from 1345 that FDA wants. They're not changes, they're just additional details. That's why they call them supplemental provisions, because these are the sections of 1345 where it says do something per the applicable regulatory requirements. Have complaint files per the applicable regulatory requirements. Your labeling has to meet the applicable regulatory requirements. So FDA said, well, we're not going to make somebody go look somewhere else. We'll just put that in this new supplemental provision. Okay. So what you get is the control of records, in particular complaint records, and what has to be contained in a complaint file. Service records, very similarly, what has to be contained in the service record. And then the batch records, including things like the reference to UDI, the unique device identifier, and the need for marking your documents with regard to confidentiality. Okay. Really is in that section on control of records. And then the section on device labeling and packaging, again, you're outlining label content that's specific to US regulations, the RX only, some of those other things. Outlining requirements for release authorizations. So your product release has to be authorized. And then the operations that you need to have to prevent mix-up. Okay, again, these are specific details that were contained in the QS reg that they didn't want to lose, but they're not changing 1345, they're just adding to it. Okay? And those supplemental provisions.
In the comments, this would be part of comment 64. The FDA essentially says that many device recalls in the United States are related to labeling and packaging. And so that was their rationale of they didn't feel like 1345 was comprehensive enough.
Correct. And they needed to add those requirements. Now, to me, this would be ripe content for a future version of 1345, maybe, but we'll see.
Get that done for us, Mark.
Yeah.
There we go.
We'll talk about the work that's going on right now and as we get towards the end. Some of the key concepts, and I think other people have highlighted this as well. The concept of risk, that four-letter word. The QS reg has it once. It's a bunch of times in the preamble and highlighting how FDA understands risk. What I highlight for people is one of the things that is always said of FDA, right? They're looking for safe and effective. Safe is the inverse of risk, right? So they have been concerned about risk. They just didn't explicitly state it anywhere. And so 1345 explicitly states the concepts of risk in several different places, including in 7.1 for product realization, one or more processes for risk management. In 4.1.2, B talks about risk-based approach to controls within the quality management system processes. Okay, and bringing that risk piece. Any place where we're talking about timeliness, proportionate, those types of things, we're directly bringing in that risk-based thinking, risk-based approach. Okay, I know you guys got to have comments on that.
Real quick, I mean, 14971 is not explicitly spelled out by FDA in their regulation,
Right.
but 1345 does talk about 14971. Essentially, you will need, if you're not familiar with 14971, to become deeply familiar with that ISO standard as
I'll
well.
mention this again. I mean, there's several standards that are mentioned within ISO 13485, but it does not require any of them except for ISO 9000 2015. Okay, that's the only normative reference, the additional requirements. All the rest of the standards are provided for your information as places to go look. Now, we often say, 14971, okay, it's not required, but how else are you going to do it?
Right.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's really no other way in med device world unless you're following 14971.
Well, and
So
as a
And the other,
developer, go ahead, Steve. Sorry.
yeah, I was gonna say the other important thing to remember is 14971 is about risk management.
risk
So
management,
the first sub bullet is where you'd apply 14971. The risk-based approach doesn't require 14971
right?
because it's the informal approach to risk management or risk-based thinking, right? So just remember that you need 14971 where the product is concerned. You need a thinking or mindset where the QMS is concerned.
And I was
Right.
going to say, as a developer, if you're and you're often developers as well, if you're going to develop and then submit for approval, you can either adhere to the standards, even though they're not required, or you can justify why you didn't, right? Because they're going to ask questions around the standards because it's what everyone else is doing. You might as well just do it according to the standard from day one, and as a result, you'll
And
Yeah,
this
it's
is
kind of like,
where
go
get
ahead,
in.
Mike.
No, I was going to say this is where I'll also point to FDA's recognized standards list. Okay, those recognized standards list are on there so that they can support submissions, right? They're not on there saying that they're required. They're just supporting your work. And so they're saying, hey, we already recognize that these are good practices, and we in essence recognize that they'll give us good practices. So if you incorporate them, it might shorten your review. Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Just
Steve.
one last point on this, kind of tying this together, the thought process, right? When you're looking at your various, elements of your QMS and you're doing your risk-based thinking, your risk-based approach, when you look at like design and development, that's a place where, they actually, the standard's pretty clear going, we're going to help you make this decision. The approach to use here on the product is risk management, right? And then you go, okay, how do I do that? Oh, well, to Dan's point, there is this 14971. Why would you not use something, right? Somebody's already done the work for you. You don't have to go figure out what that means. Yeah, there's a standard that's relatively straightforward. Let's go just use that.
And the guidance is 24971.
Yeah, right.
And there'll be a -2 coming soon on AI machine learning, and a -3 that'll be coming for combination products. So we're
So as
advancing all of this.
appropriate is actually fairly well understood and defined. You have to make sure that you then apply these lessons from these standards
Yeah.
so that you're not just deciding as appropriate on your own.
Yeah. So moving on those things, often people will try to interpret as appropriate, meaning that it's optional. I do it if, that is actually not the case. Okay, as appropriate means you must do it unless you can provide the appropriate, maybe risk-based justification of why it's not appropriate for you to do that requirement, right? So it's not indicating something that's optional. It is indicating that there might be a reason that your organization, because we're writing this for all medical device companies, there might be a reason that your organization doesn't do that particular requirement. Okay? All
Mark,
right.
a comment on that. It's comment 45 in the regulation. And we love that comment because it's FDA coming out and it's saying, I'll just read it real quick. For all devices to which design and development requirements apply, FDA does not expect manufacturers to maintain records for all changes proposed during the very early stages of the design process. You can have skunk works and science fair projects early on, and you could save yourself a lot of money by failing fast and failing early. You will have to go do all that again under full design controls later, but it is wise to do early work apart from the formal design controls process, and they have endorsed that in comment 45, which they have in the past, but it's just good to see it again.
Yep. And and that is explained also in the introduction of 1345, where it has the explanation of concepts. That is in there. So I'm not just speaking on my opinion. It's
Yeah.
what we wrote in the standard. Okay. All right. The last piece or not the last piece, but the next concept I have is the incorporation by reference. I've said this before. Here is the website, ibr.ansi.org, that you can go to. Um, what incorporation by reference means, again, is it has the legal effect as if the material was published in the Federal Register itself. And so you can't you won't be able to go to court and say, well, that was written some internationally thing. No, it was written by the US in the regulation by reference. Okay. And so all of those requirements are legally enforceable going forward. Okay. So now when you have that as appropriate and you have to do it unless you say justify why not, again, that all is legally enforceable.
And they
Okay.
say so in comment 7. I
Yep.
mean, they're like, hey, it's law. It is what it is.
Yep.
Well, February 2nd of 2026, it's law.
Yeah. All right, continuing on with our key concepts. The requirements are for the quality management system. Again, it's like saying, hey, just look at this other appendix to get your requirements, but there's no requirement for certification, and having an FDA inspection will not certify your quality management system. Okay. So if you have a certification from, any notified body, BSI, TUV, Intertech, any of those out there, that does not matter to the FDA. They are still coming. Now, MDSAP is still in place, the Medical Device Single Audit Program. And so MDSAP exempts you from routine inspections, right? And so you can still get that. But FDA can come for cause when they want to. Now, remember, they get the regulator's report part of your MDSAP audit, which gives them all the scoring. So if you get a lot of 4s and 5s, that seems like a for cause reason to come visit you. Okay, so it still allows them to come and do that. and they still will maintain their own inspection requirements and an own inspection team. In
That's a
fact,
key point, Mark. Just that, I mean, the MDSAP certificate is not what they're getting. Well, they'll probably get that too, but they're getting the scores, and that's a big deal.
yeah. So they do see the results of, what your quality management system is doing, and they do see if there's problem people out there. Okay. What I was going to say is this is actually the realization, the reason that they needed 2 years for transition. I don't think it was really for industry. It was for the FDA because, and this question comes up, and I think we'll cover it again. Um, the the current inspection technique, QSIT, Quality System Inspection Technique, okay, is in effect until February 1st. February 2nd, there'll have to be something new. Um, we can't, I mean, there's no details of that we can talk about at this point, but FDA had a major hand in writing the MDSAP audit approach. QSIT was actually used as kind of the input to MDSAP. I can't imagine them completely abandoning that because it's still out there, it's still being used by the notified bodies. It'll be somewhat close to that. Probably not exactly that because they have different, because of their inspection authority and that kind of stuff. But I can imagine it's going to be fairly close to what is currently handled in the MDSAP audit approach. Okay. Again, we can't talk about what's really happening with that, other than we know they're doing a lot of work and starting to train their inspectors.
And a comment on that, Mark, would be they're doing a lot of work so that they're ready on the second, and they gave 2 years to themselves to do that, but they also gave 2 years to all of us. And so it's not something that we're going to get away with saying, oh, it just sprung up on me. We've known about this now for a year and a half, and it's definitely
And
like if you're here, that's a good thing because you're in the know. But we run into people all the time. They're like, I don't know what you're talking about.
yeah, and we'll cover some of the actions one of the final slides as we get there.
I mean, all of us read the Federal Register every day, right?
Yeah. Well, if you're in the industry, you better be aware of this, of course. All right, so we're moving on. The next bullet, no other standards are incorporated. We've already talked about this a bit. There are several other standards that are referenced in 13485, and they're referenced in notes. Notes are not requirements. They can't be by definition per the ISO directives. Okay, they are for additional information, and they should be handled exactly that way. It's your choice to adopt those or not. Um, but almost all of them that are referenced there, I'm going to say, how else are you going to do it if you don't use that reference, that information? Whether it's biocompatibility, clean room stuff, all of those types of things. I just don't know how else you would do it unless you follow those standards.
Well, I often joke, particularly with FDA, about how they don't really understand the correct definition of guidance. Because once they say it's guidance, right, which would imply optional, they're telling you, no, this is how we want you to do it.
Well,
So,
because ultimately, where does everything get settled? In court,
right.
right?
Yep.
And so, what judge, jury would say, well, they gave you guidance on how to do it and you didn't follow that? What are you thinking?
Exactly. Yep.
Right? And write the check for whatever you owe them or go to jail.
And the same thing happens on approval, like where people try to submit all the time now with eStar. And if you have not followed the cybersecurity guidance, for example, then they
Yeah.
just reject you. So yeah, you could call it guidance, but it's really commandance because they're not going to approve you or they're not going to pass your inspection if you're not in line with their guidance.
And by the way, your reference to eStar, Dan, reminded me that the guidance and standards that we're talking about, when they're provided as recognized in the recognized database, um, you import those automatically into the eStar form now, and it comes with the recognition and all of those things, so you understand what gets recognized and what's not. So just as an aside there. Okay. Future updates to 1345, we've already covered, I think, pretty succinctly, saying, look, if there's updates to 1345, FDA is stuck on 2016 until the regulation changed. It took them 25 years to change it, almost 30 years to change it to this point. What do you think the chances are they're going to be quick about changing to a next version? Probably not going to happen. Okay. Um, just some of the, going on to definitions. Um, if you looked at the draft rule, there were a lot of definitions that FDA wanted to retain. This was the major feedback that myself and other people um, had comments on, was that they didn't need all of these extra definitions. Okay. And reinterpreting or those types of things they needed in order for us to truly be harmonized, they needed to harmonize the definitions. Okay. And a couple of those I'm going to highlight on the next slide here. Things like DMR, DHF, DHR. Okay. These are now non-existent. They are eliminated from the regulation. Okay. Having said that, there is no reason that you can't still use them. Okay. Just because I'll talk about hierarchy of definitions for a second. Okay. The hierarchy of definitions means what, overrides the others. If it's in the regulation, that's the one you have to use. Okay. So the definition of rework that's still in the in the regulation, that's the definition you must use. Okay. If it's not in the regulation, but it's in the standard 1345 and that reference to ISO 9000, that's the next piece, right? Because it's not explicitly stated, but it's in that incorporation by reference. Okay. So those definitions are the next piece that gets looked at. Okay. So this is why you need to look at 9000 section 3. Okay, and by the way, 9000 is under revision right now, and so it is 9000 2015. Okay. Um, having said that, if it's not defined in the regulation or the standard, the next place you go look is you can have your own definition or a dictionary definition. So guess what? It's not in the regulation. It's not in the DMR is not in the regulation, not in the standard, not referenced in 9000. You can write your own definition. You can use the definition that you've always used, but you're going to have to understand that is now part of a different definition. So the design history file under 1345 is called the design and development file. Okay, so understand DHF and design and development file are in essence equivalent or part of one's part of the other. So make sure that you understand that in your definition. Same thing for DHR, DMR. DMR is part of the design history file, part of the design and development file. It's also part of the medical device file. Okay. And understand those new definitions must be used, but you can still use a reference to those old things, those old terms, and define them yourself. Okay. So, and we'll come back to this. There's no need to get rid of that language in all of your procedures. Don't update them just for that. Okay, we'll talk about the reason to update them and maybe some other references you're given. All right. We're moving on to design reviews. One thing that people often bring up, and I'm sure, Dan, this is maybe one of the comments you highlighted, is 1345 does not have a direct reference to an independent reviewer that the regulation currently has. Okay. And that was very intentional. When we wrote that part of the standard, we intentionally inserted the terminology specialist personnel to take the place of an independent reviewer. Okay. Because we can, specialist personnel takes care of a whole bunch of other people that must participate in design reviews. You have to have adequate technical folks. You have to, all of these types of things. And yes, we believe that it's best practice to use an independent reviewer, but not necessarily required as long as you have all the necessary competence represented. Okay, and FDA has taken a similar approach in this, and not specifically calling out an independent reviewer anymore, but, and Dan, maybe you can give us the reference of the comment. Is that one of the ones you pulled out?
I'm
No, it's not. Okay, so
don't think so. No, there
it
were some
should be one
comments
of the
about
ones we pulled out.
training. Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
but
the
there
whole
is a direct comment on this in the FDA comments that an independent reviewer is not really necessary if you have all the necessary competence at the review. And so what all of us are saying is, look, if you need to have an independent reviewer, somebody independent of your design and development process to get an adequate review, then involve an independent reviewer. If that's been your practice in the past and you feel that that's a good practice, continue doing that, right? That is the risk, also the risk-based approach, right, to the controls in the quality management and the controls in design and development, having an independent reviewer. Okay, that could be a demonstration of your risk-based approach.
It's comment 46, by the way, and I will add that one. That's a good one.
Yeah. Okay. Steve, did you have something to add there? No.
No, I understand the logic. I'm actually a fan of the independent reviewer,
Yeah.
so I preferred it as a requirement. But I understand the logic, right? The expectations there.
Yeah. Again, uh, anybody that says I'm going to eliminate independent reviewers, then I'm going to say, well, that's not risk-based thinking. That's not a risk-based
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah, I'm not concerned with companies that already have it. Are they going to suddenly rush to get it off of their procedures? I worry about future companies that will not ever have heard of the concept, and will it even occur to them to consider it as part of their
Well,
risk-based
but
approach?
but then you'll have a non-conformance to not having the adequate specialist personnel because
Hopefully,
you
yeah,
didn't have a sufficient review,
yeah.
and it may be a suggestion for an independent reviewer. Okay, so that's how they're going to get you. All right, signatures. The 1345 doesn't require signatures for approvals, right? And the previous regulation did have specific spots they required signatures. However, let's get with the real times here. How many people actually physically sign things anymore? Usually electronic signatures or some other way that they do approvals. Now that's the key part. And the reason that we didn't write signatures into 1345 was, look, your organization is going to have a way that you indicate approvals, whether it's a stamp, uh, blood drop, whatever it is that you indicate that it was reviewed and approved. Your organization comes up with that way to do approvals. FDA agrees with us in this. This was the major one that I pressed against pretty hard because not many people do require signatures anymore. But there's still requirements for you to do release approval. So if however your organization does that approval, that's what they're going to be looking for. Okay. And then the other thing that comes up, the act, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, and parts of the regulation talked about safety and effectiveness. 1345 talks about safety and performance. Um, Often, this is actually the definition of, it goes along with the definition of quality. It's a quality product. It's safe and performs correctly, meets requirements. Okay, safety and effectiveness, safety and performance, FDA has said they're the same. Okay, don't try to get us on the language. Those are the same. Okay. All right. Moving on, just a few more here. Again, questions come up all the time on records. Many people believe that the FDA didn't look at these. That is not actually what it says in the regulation. The regulation outlined an exception to readily available for certain records. And that exception existed for management review, internal audit, and supplier audits. That is not, there's no such exception for 1345. And so there in the QMSR will no longer have this exception for those records. And FDA believes, notified bodies have looked at these for a very long time. That should not be the place that we're looking for problems, right? And FDA's, I think this is one of the areas of the new inspection technique that'll be probably better outlined for the inspectors. But the intention of looking at those records should be, is that process working? Does management review contain all of the content that's outlined in 13485? So the QS reg did not have the content outlined for a management review. Okay, but 1345 does. And so you need to make sure that you're including all of the content that 1345 outlines in your management review. Okay, because the expectation is management responsibilities will include that review of your quality management system to know that the quality management system processes are suitable, adequate, and effective. Okay, so that's the purpose of looking at management review.
I think just a quick aside, you and I have talked about this frequently, Mark. If you're already under MDSAP, right? Then, right, because you said like if it's your notified body does your MDSAP audit and they're looking at these records, FDA gets a copy of that audit report. So for years now, they've already had the ability to see these things, and it hasn't really caused any problems, at least none that I've become aware of.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's going to be. I've had people express a lot of concern about this, going, "Oh, well, now they're going to see all our dirty laundry," But it was like, well, if you're already under MDSAP, FDA has been looking at it for years and they've not used it in the wrong way, right?
Right.
If that's the concern.
And like I said, the inspection technique guide going forward is probably going to have some good guidance around this for the inspectors and industry understanding. Okay. Internal audit and supplier audits, obviously internal audit. Again, they're just looking, they want to look at it so that they know that you're auditing all of the areas or at least the risk, on a risk-based approach that you're auditing adequately, not what your findings are. They're going to focus, and my understanding from them is they're going to focus much more on the plans than they are going to really look at the reports that are associated with internal audit and supplier audits. Again, the scope has not changed for the QMSR from the QS reg, so they still do not regulate component suppliers. Okay, the QMSR is not applicable to component suppliers. Just like it's outlined in 1345 with regard to supply chain, you can require it by contract from your suppliers, but the regulation does not extend to them. Okay? But just make sure that your systems are, connected, because they're, I mean, again, many times, internal audit, supplier audits would go into CAPAs or SCARs. Management review obviously would flow into other processes as well. And so the point is making sure that your system is working correctly. Okay.
Something I would add on that, Mark, is that when you have internal audit that has findings, when you have supplier audit that has findings, and they create CAPAs, et cetera, showing good, solid intent and process and progress is half of the battle. Like, I don't know that you have to be perfect. I don't even know that you have to have it all handled, but it's like we're better today than we were yesterday, and we'll be better tomorrow than we are today. We've found that inspectors and auditors are both reasonable if you're showing good intent, good attention to detail, and a robust desire to make yourself better.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong. I mean, because the other side of this, right, is looking at those records, you now are in the position of self-declaring your problems, right? Auditors don't like writing findings on stuff that you already know about. Okay? If you're already taking actions, if you're already being timely, they're they just don't like writing things that you already know about and you're fixing, right? They're focused on trying to help you make sure that you're compliant. That sounds like it's a compliant system, right? So, uh, although we do know that there are some poor auditors out there, can imagine that at least in the beginning there'll be some poor inspections. Just make sure that those are called out, and that you do have an adequate system, right? Moving on to improvement. So Dan just talked about the continual improvement and that kind of stuff. So one other thing that comes in an improvement is this need for correction. And so complaints, non-conformances, one of the pieces it talks about is correction, which is in ISO 1345, which is fixing the problem, right? If something's broke, you fix it. Okay. And so that's part of the need for doing correction. The second part of that is then doing corrective action, preventing it from happening again. The reason we wrote this into 1345 is because so many people were getting confused between corrective action and preventive action, thinking that corrective action was fixing the problem and preventive action was preventing it from happening again. That is not true. Preventive action is preventing occurrence, preventing it from ever happening, right? And that is a completely separate thing. Okay. And I'll just answer the question because many people will talk about, well, we got this section on corrective action, and then right behind it, you have another section that looks a lot like it on preventive action. And so you have a stack of corrective actions that you've done over the, past year, and then you have the one preventive action that you made up because you didn't have one. Okay. And I'm telling our clients, stop doing that. Okay. If the auditor asks for examples of preventive actions, break out your risk management file and show them all the mitigating actions that you've done for any problems that might occur that haven't actually happened. You have a whole list of them. Okay. Those are all fit the definition of preventive action, right? Actions that you've taken to prevent occurrence. Okay. You have a whole bunch of them. Just take them to that risk management file. Okay. In the end, I've stopped having the argument about corrective action, preventive action, and that's what I call it is risk management, preventing the problem, right? Mitigations. All right. But do note that you have to, for all of your complaints, for all of your nonconformances now, consider what correction is necessary, because that's what the standard requires.
if possible.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it isn't. I should have stated it the same way it's in the standard. It's an or correction or corrective action. Um, Keep in mind, people will say that that means you do one or the other. No, no, no. Or means one, the other, or both. It's a Boolean expression, right? So one, the other, or both. Make sure that that's the case. It was one of my jobs to get rid of all the and/ors.
I was trying to think of a good
standard.
joke because I know how much you hate that.
Yeah. Uh, and/or is actually not allowed within ISO standards, even though it exists in many of them. Okay. Because it really needs to be and or, not and/or. Anyway, another soapbox, right? Part 4, corresponding changes, bringing those up. Because the current 21 CFR Part 4 for combination products references specific sections of 820, like design controls, 820.30, like management review, like purchasing, supplier controls. They, of course, needed to update that because those sections are all blank now. Okay. And so they are now providing the reference to the appropriate sections of Part 4. And just so people see that, so here's the towards the end of the final rule, Part 4 is listed in here. And so you'll see General Management Clause 4.1, 5, 6.1, okay, 7.3, 7.4, 8.5. Those are all referenced now. Okay. Having said that, okay, the intent of those references is not to be exclusive. Like that's the only part that applies. The reason that they have to give those specific references is because if you're on one side or the other of the regulation, if you were in 820, you only needed to add certain parts of 210 to 11. Okay. If you're under the regulation for 210 to 11, a pharma company, and you're now doing combination products, you need to add the requirements that are outlined there. Now, the assumption there is 210 to 11 already covers all of the other parts of the standard. right? It already covers general requirements. It already covers document control. It already covers um, these other pieces. These are just making sure that you add those to your quality management system. So if you're a pharma company and you choose to follow 1345 for your combination products, you should meet all of the requirements if you add those other parts of 210, 211 that are in part 4, right, to 1345. Okay. So don't think that you only need to do those requirements. They could still hit you for non-compliances to other parts of 1345. They're just going to reference 210, 211 for you pharma companies. Okay. While we're here and I have this other one up, here's the section on part 820. Okay, so you can see subpart A, it's general provisions, and those pieces. Here's subpart B with the control of records and device and labeling. So you can see all of the numbers are changed and updated to fit in here. So just again, so you have that reference. Okay. All right. So moving on to some common misconceptions. I just talked about one with regard to part 4, but many organizations will ask us, do I need to update all of my documents to use 1345 terminology now? Reality, no. There's never been a requirement for you to use FDA or ISO terminologies. Call things what you want, but you need to make sure that your definitions meet the requirements. In other words, you might provide reference to them. Now, it's like anything else that we've just talked about. If you're following the standard, why would you not just use what's there? Right? Why complicate things? Why make it, harder on yourself? Just use the words that are there. Okay. But I mean, I understand some people like DHR, some people like DMR. Okay, still use them. You can, but you need to provide reference to what the requirements actually are.
I often joke with people. I said, look, if you want to call your DHF Bob, go right ahead. But
Right.
somewhere the definition of Bob better align, right, with the definition of DHF. And
Yep.
now going forward, the DDF. So
Okay. Um, Another misconception that you can't incorporate the changes until February 2nd. And I think there was something in the chat that asked about it. Yes, it is a single day turnover, but the reality is there aren't any conflicting requirements. Just don't remove anything that demonstrates compliance to the current QS reg. In other words, don't get rid of records. Just change it so it also meets the requirements of 1345. Okay, and give the appropriate reference and notes. Now, one of the things that I will say that kind of maybe flies in the face of that, if you're an organization that has referenced throughout your procedures a specific part of 820, okay, your design and development procedure references 820.30. 820.30 doesn't exist anymore going forward, right? And so, yes, you're going to need to change those. I would say that it's not a best practice to reference either the section of 1345 or that particular part of the regulation. I advocate to our clients that in their top level documents, their quality manual, how the quality management system is organized, something that outlines that they just simply put a reference to ISO 1345, a reference to 820. Because guess what? 820 is still the correct reference. It's 21 CFR 820 under the QMSR. Okay. Those types of things. So do provide those more generic references at the top level documents. If there's specific things for a specific part of the regulation, yes, reporting stays the same in 803. So your regulatory reporting process might directly reference part 803. Okay. Recalls part 806. Yeah, that stays the same. So your recall may reference part 806, but it doesn't reference 806.1 or 806.2, right? It just references that top level piece, which is unlikely to change, just like 820 is not changing. All right, next one, that you need to become 1345 certified. The reality is FDA has clearly, many times, clearly stated that 1345 certification does nothing for your FDA requirements. Okay? You still have to register as a facility. You're still open to inspection. Okay? Again, MDSAP because FDA has agreed that MDSAP will take place of routine inspections, but they're going to come and look at you if they have a cause. Okay? And they are not going to give that up. And likewise, FDA will not be offering certifications. They're not going to say that you're certified. You cannot say that FDA certifies you, your quality management system, because they don't, and they never have, and they likely never will. Okay? All right. So those hopefully take care of the misconceptions. Any other ones out there that people want to have us take a shot at? No?
Yeah, what other doom and gloom warnings have you been hearing out there that we can address, kind of like Mythbusters here?
Anything? Well, if you think of them, we'll come back to questions.
Yeah.
All right. So actions to consider. Okay. First, yes, 1345 has a requirement for a quality manual. Yes, I'm aware 9001 does not any longer, but 1345 still does. If you don't have one, you have to follow the requirements in 4.2.2 of 1345 that outlines the scope, reference to SOPs, describes process interactions, and outlines your document structure. Okay, these are some of the base requirements of the quality manual. Even under 1345, people have said, well, it does. I'm sorry, 9001. People have said, well, it no longer has a direct requirement for a quality manual. Yeah, because 9001 is written for every type of organization, from mom and pop, corner store, all the rest of them, on up. Not everybody needs a quality manual. Okay, but if you have a quality manual, and so if you've had a quality, have something that you use as quality manual, you're going to continue using that in your organization because that's the risk-based approach. That's risk-based thinking. It outlines how your quality management system works. Okay, so don't think people can get rid of them just because there might not be a requirement. And I'm kind of speaking towards maybe the next version of 1345. Understand that those are good practices. Okay. Ensure your terminology aligns. We've talked about this a couple times now. You don't have to quit using it, but you just need to ensure that there's an alignment there. Okay. So design and development file is the requirement outlined within 1345. Make sure that your design history file or those parts of design history file meet the requirements. Okay, or what meets which parts of the requirements. Okay, same thing for DMR device master record. It's part of the medical device file. It's part of the design and development file. Make sure that there's the appropriate references and alignment there. Okay. And then applying a risk-based approach. Okay. Applying a risk-based approach to the controls in the quality management system is a requirement of 1345, which means it will be an FDA inspection item. Okay. At a minimum, there's some places where it says proportionate to risk, commensurate with risk is some of the other terminology that's used. At a minimum, training effectiveness, supplier controls, and software validation of software used within the quality management system, okay, are commensurate, are proportionate to risk. Okay, so you have to use them in those places. Otherwise, anywhere that something about timeliness exists, so taking action without undue delay, where you have intervals like management review, like calibration, preventive maintenance, risk-based approach are good in those areas. Okay, and if you have questions about those, we can certainly help you answer those questions of how to apply the risk-based approach. what's going to come up is almost certainly they'll point out practices that are not risk-based. Okay. I have management review annually. Why do you have management review annually? Well, you better have some risk-based rationale of why that interval is set. Okay. So be able to answer those questions. And you should have some ready examples of how your organization has applied a risk-based approach. You made a decision to move from paper documents to an electronic quality management system because there was a risk of document loss in paper or fire or flood or those types of things. So we went to an electronic quality management system. That's the application of a risk-based approach. Okay. And my last piece on actions is awareness. Make sure all of your employees understand that there is a major change in the regulation here. You're going from following a US regulation to still following a US regulation, but all of the requirements come from an international standard. Okay. And people have to be aware of that. Those are questions that are likely to be asked. Were you instructed or given any other information on the change in regulations? So your employees better be able to answer that. Okay. Just going back in some of the chat stuff, because I think if I go forward, I'm into the questions, right? We want to
Yep.
play up the experts. Christy, I saw, up until February, FDA follows QSIT. That is true. As long as the QS reg is in force, which is up until February 1st, FDA will continue to follow QSIT. So if you have an audit or an inspections on February 1st, they'll follow QSIT. If you have it on February 2nd, they'll follow some other technique that is yet to be published. Okay. E-Star was in here.
Any changes to labeling was another question.
I'm not aware that this would affect labeling at all.
Yeah, I can't think of anything direct in that regard.
It might affect your labeling processes. Again, follow the supplemental provisions to
Yeah,
make
because
sure
you have to
that,
make sure you document your UDI, right, which is not specifically called out in 1345, but you would have had to already be compliant with UDI requirements. So it's not
yeah,
a new requirement or a change in the requirement. It's just make sure you keep a record, right, that
right.
shows, yes, we know what UDI gets applied to what device.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the key here is that if you're a European manufacturer compliant with 1345 coming to the United States, there will be additional labeling requirements just like there have been in the past.
Yeah.
And the fact that this is unified, this is one area where it is not yet unified. I would anticipate, like you said, Mark, that in future versions of 1345, I would expect to see them add some more rigor around labeling to become more harmonized.
Yeah. Dan, your comment about being certified at 1345, are you ready for QMSR? Maybe.
Mostly, yeah.
Mostly. If
One
you
point
so
I make
the
here,
well, the
just
phrase
to,
that I would use, if I can just finish that up first, the phrase that I would use if you are fully compliant to ISO 13485, you are ready for QMSR. Okay? And there's just those additional a couple of supplemental requirements with regard to records and stuff like that. But you've likely already been doing that, like I said, because they came from the QS reg. Okay? So that's what I would say, Dan. Go ahead.
and what I was going to add is not all notified bodies are the same.
Right.
So there are notified bodies like BSI or DECRA or
And
some
there's
others that
good
are,
auditors and not so good auditors.
yeah, if you have a strict notified body with a strict auditor and they're coming and really making you better, that's one thing. But there are notified bodies that are easier to get certified and you may not be as compliant as you think you are by a certificate. So just be careful to make sure that you're using notified bodies and auditors that we prefer strict at our company because I would rather pay to have somebody come in and be strict so that when somebody comes in to inspect,
Fix the problem.
yeah.
Yeah,
And
I don't
this
know
is
how many
what
times I walk into do an internal audit on behalf of a client, and I want
yep.
to just smack whoever did their certification or notification inspection because I go, how did they not call this out? Now
Yeah.
I'm going to be the bad guy, right?
Right. Because I mean, notified bodies now have they've implemented the practice that an auditor can only come and be your auditor for 2 audits. And then the next one beyond that has to be somebody else.
Hmm.
Okay. FDA has a similar practice. They don't allow the same inspector to go back to companies more than a couple times. You don't want to be in that position when the next one comes and, oh, we passed the last one, and all of a sudden now they're writing 10 or 12 nonconformances because they have different eyes. Okay. So, and Dan is, what do you want to know is written? If
He
you can,
wants to know where that's written that you can only come twice and have to get a new
Yeah,
guy.
it's usually in your contract with your,
it's in their
body.
yeah, it's in their contract and in their internal policies.
And it's part of notified body certification now. So
Yep.
in
Yeah.
order for them to remain
Yeah,
certified,
for them to get their accreditation,
Accreditation, yeah.
right, they had to, abide by implementing
Those practices.
policies, right?
we
Yeah.
like to think about it as, I mean, we're a contract design and manufacturer. And so when people come to audit us, ultimately, if we run into problems, all of our clients are now in problems as well. And so we like to say that the most stringent audit we will ever get is our internal audit. The next one
Right.
is our hired audit. The one after that should be the inspection. You should be as harsh as possible on yourself so that when you get into the real deal of an FDA inspection, it should be fairly straightforward. There's going to be something, but it should be something that is not surprising and you can address quickly.
Yep. All right, we have about 8 minutes left here or so. What other questions are out there?
There were a couple of comments on my list that I think maybe bear some comment.
Sure.
One is comment 14 from the FDA that says the objective of the QMSR is to correct and prevent poor practices, not simply bad product.
Right.
And just the idea that you're not just trying to get good medical devices out to the marketplace, you're trying to create better companies that consistently create better products. So I thought that was a good one. Another one is comment 27, which says a culture of quality meets regulatory requirements through a set of behaviors, attitudes, activities, and processes. And top management ensures that applicable regulatory requirements are met through the integration of QMS processes, that at the top levels of your company, they should be dialed in and passionate about good quality. And so we just have a policy around our company and we try to preach it from the rooftops anytime we can that quality is not this vicious overlord. It needs to be
Collaborative
a collaborative
together.
partner. Your
Yeah.
quality group and your implementation groups should be hand in hand and partners to make a better company and hence better product for the public good. And so, to the extent that you feel overlorded, that's a time for a culture change where you can say, hey, here's what's going on here. How do we bake this more into the system so it just happens more naturally and culturally?
While you have a quality management system, and it may be alongside your business management system, they need to be integrated, right? This is, and I've preached and done a lot of work on integrated management systems. So if you have an environmental management system, a information security management system, all these other systems, they need to be integrated together. It's why we're working towards alignment and harmonization through a harmonized approach. Okay. All right. Thanks for that, Dan. Any other ones?
Well, you had mentioned before that an FDA inspection will not get you a 1345 certification, and nor
Correct.
does a 1345 certification prevent you from an FDA inspection.
Right.
But they are going to change their inspection practices, and they're going to do it in a
Yes.
way that complies, and we don't really know what that looks like yet. So you
Yep.
had said all that, but I think it's important. Um,
And oh, by the way, the MDSAP audit process is being updated, the audit approach, because of course the FDA and some of many of their in MDSAP have a specific callouts that are part of the current regulation, right? That will go away under the QMSR. And so MDSAP audit approach will be updated as well. So expect that. All right.
All right, what else is on your minds?
Come on, folks. Uh, Efraz, you're honestly, you're correct. Independent reviewers can be essential to unbiased evaluation. Okay, some people can't separate themselves from a design and development, their baby, right? And they're not going to say bad things about their baby. Independent reviewers in your organization may be essential. Don't eliminate them. You can still point to that part of ISO 1345 that talks about specialist personnel. And that was the direct intent. And you'll see more, and I didn't mention it. Um, there was that reference to the practical guide that I referenced up front. That practical guide is actually in the process of being updated. I'm actually the project lead for that. We were lucky enough to get, just like ISO 14971's guidance is 24971. So ISO TS 23485 will be coming sometime early next year
Hmm.
to provide additional guidance. That's one of the areas that I know we're addressing that don't eliminate independent reviewers because independent reviewers are part of that specialist personnel that we intended there. And that, again, was a very intentional thing that was done. So don't eliminate them and point to that requirement as your independent reviewer rather than it's specifically saying the words independent reviewer.
One
Okay?
other comment I would make, Froz, is that at our company, we use independent review extensively, and we also keep obviously the people that did the development there. I would say that 80 to 90% of the issues are found by the person that did the work as they're presenting to the independent reviewer. And so they start to go, they're like, well, wait a minute. Oh, yeah, look at that. And they're finding it, but it is the very act of presenting it to an independent reviewer that leads to it being found, oftentimes by the one who did it in the first place. And so we agree, it's probably not appropriate to eliminate them.
Yeah. Uh, there's no push to eliminate independent reviewers. There's nobody, no auditor, no anybody with any savvy is not going to say, "Oh, get rid of that." They're going to say, "Well, that's just a specialist personnel that's necessary for you to have an adequate review." Okay? All right. Come on, there's got to be some other people out there. Ross, you got to have some questions for us. Call you out. Dan, you've been pretty good at asking questions. Anybody else?
No, I mean, I think you've covered everything I was looking for. I mean, we've got ISO 13485 in our major facility, and then we've got a satellite organization that's ISO 9001. So,
Yep.
but also registered with the FDA under the current 21 CFR.
Yep.
So, we know what we've got to do. We're just gonna. I think it was really encouraging that um, if we've got a robust 13485 system in place, we're
Yep.
pretty much a good way towards meeting
And
all of the QMSR requirements. So
and
that was encouraging.
I would remind you there's an Annex B, I think it is, of 1345, right? That gives you a correlation between 1345 and 9001.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what we're using to build that out. So
Okay. Mark J, I know you're out there with auditing. What kind of questions do you have?
I don't have any. You covered it really, really well. You answered the big questions that a lot of people have, and I really appreciated the insight, though. It helps me understand a little bit better too. But no particular questions at this time.
Okay. Yeah, and hopefully, I mean, there's a lot of people ringing alarm bells, saying, "Oh, you have a whole bunch of work to do," and that kind of stuff. I hope that, in presenting this and helping people understand kind of where a lot of this comes from, that it should quell your fears a little bit.
mhm.
It should help you understand that, yeah, just make a progression towards, the full compliance with ISO 1345, and you're going to be fine. And it's usually practices that you've already been doing. So this is not a big leap for you guys. Just like Russ is outlining, we understand 1345. So we're just, business as usual.
So Mark, in terms of referencing, because you said 21 CFR 820 is still the regulation.
Yep.
How do we title that in their quality manual? Because we see it's 21 CFR 820 quality system regulation.
Yep.
Do we actually put quality management system regulation now as the title document?
Yep. It is that's one thing that has to change. You can't reference quality system regulation anymore. It has to be quality management system regulation.
Regulation. Yep. Okay. Yep. So that's the term we'd use then. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Because if you write quality system regulation, you're referencing the old 820.
Right, and exactly. And
Yeah,
the fact they kept the
It
21
becomes the
CFR.
equivalent of putting a date right on the end of the reference to 820.
Yep. Got
But
it.
the regulation, the final rule does change the name.
Yep.
Okay.
Right.
And Mark, before you send out the slides, I'll give you an intro slide on me so people have my contact info as well. And
Yep.
when I sent you my observations on the new QMSR, it is not an exhaustive summary. It's just the ones that caught my attention and made me think. So
Great.
And
We'll do
as
that.
always, our contact info through QRx is on the screen right now. Dan's will be with that as well. Thanks, Mark J. Go ahead and you can email us, contact at QRx Partners. If you go to our website, qrxpartners.com, and click on either mine or Steve's pictures, you get our email directly.
Or we have an ask an expert
Ask an
page
expert
on there.
Yep. So feel free to pass our information on to others as well. We're glad to answer questions from anybody.
Cool.
Great.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you all
you.
for attending.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yep.